Hello and welcome to Inspiral Out Loud, where Mars and I are chatting about energy today. So let's then have a look at some of the possibilities of how things could be better. You mentioned before about using solar hot water in housing. So I know you've spoken about the negative side of solar, but you said that this one is a positive. So why or how is that different?
Well, it's different because part of the problem with solar power is for electricity production is electricity production through solar cells requires, once again, it goes back to resources and the pollution that's created by mining and everything else. Solar cells need a lot of a very pure silicon, and you have to get that from somewhere. You have to process it, mine it. Then you've got the plastics involved and all of those things. They're also not very efficient. At best, you're going to get about 20% efficiency out of current solar cells. Whereas solar hot water, can convert far more energy directly into heat energy, which of course, when you're using solar energy for production of electricity, you have all of the polluting and problems and difficulties with producing solar cells for electricity production. You need silicon, which has to be a pretty high grade silicon to do it. You've got to process it. Then you've got all the plastic paneling, you've got all the materials that sit in the sun, which break down because of the ultraviolet component of the sun. So they don't last forever. You're going to get about maybe 20 years out of the cells. You've got to look at how much energy is used to produce those cells. Then you've got to look at the efficiency of those solar cells. They don't produce a lot of electricity compared to the energy they're receiving from the sun. At best, you're getting about 20% efficiency. When it comes to solar hot water, it doesn't require all of those materials that can break down. I mean, they do currently, but it's very easy to produce solar hot water with materials that should last you a lifetime. And there's a much higher conversion ratio. So you're better off using solar for your heating options rather than your electricity production options, at least with the current technologies we have.
Yeah. And so when you're talking about solar hot water, rather than having solar cells that are then sending electricity to go to a heater to heat your water, you're talking about your black strips that have the water moving through them specifically, like on rooftops.
Yeah, that's right.
So so the water is receiving that energy directly rather than being sent through some external technology, which you're saying is where it reduces its efficiency.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we know that there's been a lot of experimentation with all sorts of different forms like wind energy, tidal, geothermal, hydroelectricity, all sorts of things. And again, a lot of those you're saying comes back to storage is always going to be the issue. Do you have any comments around how that storage can be actually improved?
There have been a couple of ideas thrown around about how that can be done, but a lot of those ideas have not really been explored to their full potential. For example, one idea was put around that you could basically during the daytime you could, for example, pump water from one place to another, which in a higher elevation, so that during the time when the motor no longer runs, if that's run off solar or wind power or whatever it would be used to convert to pump the water up, then during the periods where you're not receiving that energy, you could use the potential energy from that stored water to produce electricity as it drops again through a pump or a generator. A lot of the non-polluting varieties of energy storage have not really been fully explored, which is unfortunate. But when it comes to tech companies that are largely trying to find the solutions to all of these things, they want to do it with a certain mindset. They want to, of course, produce a profit. And a lot of the devices that they're producing in this disposable era don't last for very long. They don't last, certainly not long enough to warrant the expense and cost involved with producing them. And so perhaps people out there have some good ideas that are worth developing that have not been thought of yet. But yeah.
And you did mention solar cells that don't use silicon. They use the infrared spectrum instead of visible light.
Yeah, like a lot of these ideas that have popped up, they just seem to disappear again just as quickly. I suspect there's political and other motivations for why these things disappear, but there weren't many discussions, I think it was about 8 years ago, that I saw where there was already the ability to produce solar cells that were something like 80% efficient, and because they responded not to the visible light spectrum that current solar cells use, but actually the infrared. And there's a huge amount of energy coming from the sun in the form of infrared energy. That's what heats up the planet and gives us our warmth. And they got it to the point where they were talking about the potential of a type of paint that would be used. So you wouldn't even need to install panels. You could literally paint it on your roof. So that would have been a brilliant option if it were developed further. And even if it wasn't done as a paint, even if it was still panels, where you're still talking a massive jump in efficiency, which would warrant the use of those.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, that seems to have largely gone to the wayside. I don't hear any discussion about it in the mainstream or tech companies talking about it. Yeah.
And what about, you mentioned the steam engine that the two guys collaborated on.
Yeah, there were two gentlemen in, I believe it was Canada. I saw this about 12 years ago. One of them had produced a very highly efficient steam engine. It wasn't like like a locomotive style with pistons and all sorts of contraptions going on. It was actually essentially two tubes, one inside the other, and the one on the inside had a series of holes punched through it. So it was a very cheap thing to produce. He built it in his garage, and it was an incredibly efficient thing, and it ran off pressurized steam. And he happened to find out that another gentleman in his neighborhood was working on a steam generator that used the difference between a very small temperature change in the environment would be used to, you'd run water through these series of black panels, and they didn't work by directly heating them like the way solar hot water works. They actually worked by the difference between two temperatures. So it actually worked even in cold climates, would actually produce steam just by the difference of the two temperatures. So the two of these guys got together and joined forces, and they came up with a device that would basically power 50 100-watt light bulbs. So that's 5 kilowatts of energy for free, and it would work down to something like I think it was minus 20 degrees centigrade, which is a pretty impressive effort, and it would work day or night.
All right.
So
Interesting.